Hello. Okay. This is the show for you to talk about containers with me. And if you're in one of my courses, I am here to answer questions. So I'm not at home this week in the studio. This is actually one of the times a year that we go off-site, essentially to plan the year and plan like what courses we're going to update, what new courses we're going to do, everything, training, education, all about containers and DevOps. So I'm here for you. I'm actually in an Airbnb off the Potomac River in Maryland, USA. And yeah, you can see the water in the background there. That's not fake, that's real. This is not a Zoom background. So luckily there's decent internet here, and I thought I would do a live Q&A this week where we just talk about the courses, your questions. Let's get into it. So in case this is new for you, if you haven't been here every week, for over 2 years now, I'm live on the internet on Thursdays, and I do things like this, where I have a Patreon site, page, whatever you want to call it, And if you're interested, you can sign up for all my updates, whether it's big course changes, new blog posts like I just posted this week about Docker versus Kubernetes versus Containerd. You don't have to pay if you don't want, but you can buy me a coffee to support this show, the podcast, all the other things that I do, including the open source content on GitHub. And you can just click that little follow button there, and you'll essentially get a private feed of just the things I'm creating. And for those of you that are supporting me through membership, I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. We are having fun over in the Discord chat, so you can see the link to that above. We've got multiple links. This live show, my website, and then the devops.fan, which you can go check out. That is our Discord chat server, similar to lots of other chat systems, but just a little bit more fun. So if you're a fan of DevOps, go check that out. We've got over, I think we've got thousands of people in there now, maybe 2,000. I haven't checked recently in the last week, but lots of signups over there. And of course, we always have the Slack chat, which comes with the courses as well. That's not going away. It's just an option in case you want to do Slack or Discord. That's there for you. So let's get into some questions. We've already got some coming up. Let's see. I probably get this a lot, but what technologies should I learn to enter a DevOps role? So I have a post on that. It's actually on my AMA. Let's go. Let's go over here. So I will put this URL in chat. And yeah, there's a short URL, bret.show/DevOps. So this is a question I get a lot, and I have lots of opinions on it. There are no right or wrong answers necessarily when it comes to the world of tech, because the DevOps role is very vague, and it's often very dependent upon the organization that wants to implement that. So you can see lots of jobs where the word DevOps is in the title, but they're completely different jobs. One of them might be that you are managing containers and maybe Kubernetes or something. One might be that you're doing nothing but Jenkins. One might be more of an SRE role, site reliability, where you're focused maybe on the application code and improving it in terms of how well it runs in a distributed system, improving its monitoring metrics, all those sorts of things, right? So those job roles can be completely different, but we tend to suck at naming things, so we all have titles with the word DevOps in them, even though the job isn't consistent. Even amongst just like, if you're a Jenkins person, the CI tools out there are widely different in terms of, there's dozens of them that everybody uses. And so knowing one doesn't necessarily mean you automatically know the other. So I have lots of opinions here about what you can start with. Basically, the strategy is about first learning what DevOps is as a mindset and as a strategy for a company, and not necessarily a job role. And then starting to focus on understanding all those steps and learning one tool to start with, just one tool in each of those steps. So learning a cloud solution or a virtualization solution, learning a CI tool that may do CD, continuous deployment, as well as testing. Maybe learning a Kubernetes technology or a distribution of Kubernetes, as well as learning Docker. Maybe learning an automation tool like Terraform or Ansible, right? So you would learn one of these, and then you would have all of that stuff, just one of those tools. Pick a cloud, any cloud, AWS, okay? And once you've learned those, learning a comparable tool is not as hard. So if you know AWS, learning the basics of some other cloud hoster isn't necessarily going to be starting from scratch, right? And also when you go for job interviews, those job interviews are going to be very specific to their stack. So if you know you want to work at a specific company, or you already work there and you want a job in DevOps, then you already know what tools they're using, and you should learn those tools. If you're just learning tools for the sake of any job that you might get, you're just going to have to pick a few, learn those few, and then if the job you're applying for doesn't use those specific ones, you should be able to show your way of learning. It's a big deal in all of tech now, but just in DevOps as well. How well do you learn and how do you learn? Be prepared to explain that in an interview, including answering questions like, what was the last thing you learned? What do you plan to learn this year? What does your home lab look like? Which is a question that I often ask. How do you learn at home? What's your lab? Is it lab equipment physically? Is it virtual on the internet? Do you just run a bunch of virtual machines on your laptop? Describe your setup and what you're playing with. That's often questions you will get because managers don't care as much about what you know right now, because in 3 years, you'll have to know completely new stuff. So it's more important sometimes that you learn fast and you know how to learn and you have your own learning methodology than you know the specific tool that they might be using right now, because these tools change. So I hope that helps. Is there a way or a tool to convert a running or stopped container into a Docker service without having to manually inspect and carefully craft a compose file? Not that I know of. I think years ago there was experiments and ideas, including a tool that one of the Docker captains made that would export your swarm config and provide sort of like an export import, but that hasn't been updated in 3 years. I'm not even sure it works anymore. And quite frankly, I forgot the name of it because I don't know anyone that used it. It was more of an idea, but no, it didn't really catch on. So sorry about that, Tutuko. Let's see. Hello there. McCool, hopefully I pronounced that close to what it's supposed to be. Sorry about that. Most of the companies still suggest to use databases and bare metal services where they manage replication, clustering, backups, etc., instead of using containers. Is there any reason for this limitation? It is not a limitation. It's simply a perception. It's simply an opinion. I run databases all the time in containers. Containers don't make databases slower. If you implement a container database solution and you're properly storing the databases in volumes, they will use resources just like any other normal app, whether it's on bare metal in a VM. Now, your choice of virtualization or bare metal doesn't have anything to do with containers, because you can run containers on bare metal, you can run containers in virtualization. Containers are just a way to encapsulate your app in a protected boundary. It doesn't actually nest it in a sub-virtual machine or anything, right? It's not like virtual machines where it's emulating hardware and doing synthetic transactions. It's acting as a normal app on a normal OS. It just happens to be firewalled. This might be maybe a term you might use, but it's not really the right term there. But it's got boundaries and hard edges around it, so it can't escape. It can't see outside of its contained file system and resources. But if you give 64 gig and 4 CPUs to a database in a container, that will run the same exact way as if it was on a physical server of the exact same server, not running in a container, and that had that same level of resources. And I've tested this. There's actually on my website, I think it's bretfisher.com/Docker. There is, on that website, I did some work with Docker Inc. and HPE, where we actually did analysis on HP hardware of the performance of databases in virtual machines with containers, and then in bare metal with containers. And big surprise, databases run faster in bare metal no matter how you do it. If you don't need virtualization, your databases don't work so hard because the virtual machines take up a bunch of RAM. Like if you start up a Red Hat server, it's already using a gig of RAM when you start the VM, right? And there's a bunch of file storage for duplicating all the VM files and all that. So if you can go bare metal, by all means do it, but it's not a requirement. And it's just a different set of tools you're using. And I think a lot of times database people are very concerned about performance. Database performance is a key factor in success of a database platform. So if people can do bare metal, like bare metal is the thing, do bare metal. But most people can't afford it. So they do virtualization, or they don't need an entire server's resources dedicated to a database. So they split those up into virtual machines. Nowadays, if I was going to create this from scratch, I would probably create in a data center for a private company. If they were going to do that, I would take a bare metal server, knowing that they would maybe need 8 database servers. And I would create 8 database containers on a bare metal system. That way I get the most use of the hardware resources. I get the best performance since I'm not running a bunch of VMs. But the databases themselves run the same way. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes, this is a GitHub Tshirt. This is, I forgot what the name of this AutoCAD is. It's, I can't remember the name of it. Oh, it's on their website. You can buy it on their website. It's a cool name. It's like Death Cat or something. I don't remember what it was. Clone. It's some Git term. It's going to bug me now. Someone's going to have to look it up. Anton, I really enjoyed the course, but I'm looking for more internals, C groups and namespaces. So I referenced those in the course to one of my good friends, Jerome Pedizzoni, who has a YouTube video on how Docker works with namespaces and C groups. He did entire talks on that for years, so it's a 50-minute talk. It's somewhere in the course, but I can send you the link now. I do not plan on adding that myself because Jerome does such a great job with it. I just sent you a link to the YouTube video in the course. So let me see if I can find that real quick. There we go. Yeah, so I'm going to put, Roman, this is an AutoCAD, but each AutoCAD has their own name, and this one has a very specific name. It's, I cannot remember what it is. I'll have to look it up. But all right, so I put a link in chat to a video from Jerome Pedizzoni on C groups and namespaces. He was the original DevOps guy at Docker before they were Docker. So I really felt like his video did a great job at looking at the kernel and the kernel source code. And to be quite honest, Anton, of all the teams that I work with that are deploying Docker into production, very, very few people ever need to know that level of stuff. So I didn't feel like it was necessary for someone to use Docker day to day. Doesn't mean you shouldn't learn it. It just wasn't required learning for my students, and I already had 19 hours of video. So I just didn't add more of that stuff. But thanks for the feedback. Always looking to make it better. Maybe what I can do, Anton, is I can make a written lecture that describes some of the basics. That's like a really short couple paragraphs. And then link to his YouTube video from there, because I know sometimes the links as resources inside each lecture, they kind of get lost a little bit. So maybe I can do that. All right, I'm new to Docker, but one of the first thing I came across when starting was an announcement of Kubernetes dropping some kind of support for Docker. Would you be able to explain what it's about? All right, so go back in my channel, right above me, Bret.live. There's an entire episode, at least a full episode from months ago. If you just go back in the video list, there's an entire Kubernetes drops Docker support or something like that. And we did a whole hour on it. And I actually had one of the Docker engineers, Justin, on with me for, actually we were almost an hour and a half long of all the details. This doesn't really impact you in 95% of use cases. So in fact, it actually doesn't impact anyone, because after that announcement, Mirantis, a company that bought some of the Docker enterprise tooling, they announced that they are going to make their own Docker shim to continue support of Docker in the future. So essentially the middleware that connects Docker and Kubernetes is still going to be supported. It's just going to be a different repo. So it's totally not an issue. The truth is that Kubernetes started out at DockerCon 5 years ago as a way to make multiple Docker servers work together. Then the community said, we would like a smaller runtime that isn't as user-friendly as Docker and uses less memory and less resources. So then Docker created containerd to do that. So normally when you run when you run Kubernetes today, normally, and increasingly more normally, you are going to be using containerd as the underlying runtime. And that's fine because you never touch that thing anyway. So it doesn't really matter if it's Docker or containerd or cryo. It doesn't matter which one it is. It's not going to really, for 99% of people, affect their setup. It may only affect you if you do a manual deployment of Kubernetes using something like kubeadmin, which I don't recommend most people do. I recommend most people use something like Rancher or a cloud-based Kubernetes that's provided for you, or maybe VMware's Kubernetes, or Docker Enterprise that's now run by Mirantis, or any of these other Kubernetes tools. All of those tools make that decision for you and install the runtime for you. Because remember, Kubernetes doesn't run containers. Kubernetes controls a container runtime that then it runs containers. And for the history of Kubernetes, Docker has been that, but Docker was never designed to be that. It wasn't optimized for automation from a higher level tool and to be the thinnest, lightest little container runtime. That's why they spun off part of Docker and called it containerd. So in essence, when you run Kubernetes without Docker, you're still running the core parts of Docker, and it's all just fine. But there's a whole show on it. Go back to Bret.live and check that out. All right, Starboy. Is SRE similar to a sysadmin? No, although there are a few things in similarities, like you are going to be dealing with servers typically. You're going to be managing a little bit of infrastructure typically. But go look up SRE. You'll find a Google book, at least one, on the topic of system reliability engineering. And the SRE mindset is more about making sure that your apps that your developers are deploying onto servers, and maybe you'll have dedicated operations people that are managing the ops of an enterprise. And SREs, their job is really to improve the reliability of the app and the systems that run it. So they're largely concerned with metrics about, how fast things deploy, what's the failure rate on deployment, how reliable is this, where can I get better metrics out of these applications, how can I monitor it better, how can I improve the uptime of this system? And they go to work. They might be more developer oriented, where they're actually developing code in the apps to improve its reliability, improving its metrics, maybe creating specific endpoints for monitoring in applications. And so they're not focused on making user end features. It's almost like their customers are the developer team itself, as well as the operators who are having to operate the servers. So it's a relatively new idea. I tend to like to look at it as, in DevOps today, if you're in a modern team that is doing all the modern things, right? Cloud engineering, distributed computing, obviously stuff like Agile for development workflows, then an SRE is maybe the job title and the mindset, but DevOps is the practice of working with the developers, the project managers, the operators, and trying to increase the velocity of your software programs. So meaning shipping them faster, recovering from failure faster, reducing the number of failures, that sort of thing. And I would maybe make the SRE a job title of someone who's always concerned about that stuff and is trying to improve the product that way. So, all right, good questions. Biker's back. I love the courses, have gone through them multiple times, but need more in the Kubernetes, in particular persistent volumes and claims, practical examples in NFS share. For sure, like the next, after we fix all the stuff in Kubernetes, which we're definitely behind on, then what the next section is going to be is on storage and talking about the core storage, the volumes, the persistent volume claims, what do those mean, and then some basic examples on local volumes, maybe some network file shares, some cloud storage, different drivers. That's going to be the first new section that's added to the course. And you can see that at the end of the Kubernetes Mastery course. That second to last lecture lists all of the different videos and sections that are coming. And I think it's in order. And the next section, which you can see in the slides, you can actually see a lot of the slides today. If you go through the slides, that's slides.kubernetesmastery.com. You can go through a lot of the future slides, hundreds and hundreds of them that are already there. It's just not the videos that are created yet. So expect those this year. Mm-hmm. Yep. Is there a way to call a host command from a Docker container? The command is on all hosts. Yes. So this is a very... Okay, so we're going to just talk about a Docker container. I'm assuming you're running Docker on the server, right? Because this solution does depend on if you're using Docker daemon. So if you go to dog versus cat, dog versus .cat, which is my repo for this. Here's a good example. So this is a swarm service, but it could just as easily be a Docker run command. So this Docker run command will mount the socket of the host Docker daemon into the container. And then I'm just running, in this case, I'm just running the Docker image. So really the only thing in that image is the Docker client binary. At least that's the only binary in there we're using. And then I'm running a bash loop that basically says, in this case, I'm saying every day, prune my images on the host OS. It's a way, in this case, I'm doing sort of a cleanup of the images on the host to make sure that Docker doesn't fill up the hard drive with old images. It's one of those things that you don't realize you need to do on a Docker machine or a swarm machine. If you're using Kubernetes, this particular command isn't needed because Kubernetes has its own cleanup functionality. You could technically do this from a Kubernetes pod. You could create this override command here for running the container in a Kubernetes pod, but I don't recommend that pods control the runtime, because in this case, we're not talking to Kubernetes. We're talking about connecting to the runtime that Kubernetes controls. And I don't recommend in a Kubernetes cluster that you have any programs outside of Kubernetes itself control the runtime. You really don't want two different things controlling the runtime, because that will end up with problems where you've got things going that are sort of funky, where, in other words, in this case, right, if I told it to do this directly to Docker on a machine, and then I had Kubernetes controlling this Docker machine, and I also told Kubernetes to clean up the images, we basically have two conflicting things, and neither one of them knows about each other, right? They're both controlling the container runtime, but they don't know how to talk to each other, so you don't want to do that. I hope that helps. So remember, that's it, dog versus .cat under the stack prune YAML file. Biker says, did the entire K8s class on your Raspberry Pi cluster. So here's an interesting thing. We had a show all last week about the M1 processor and the new Apple MacBooks and the Mac line of stuff, and how I think that's going to ultimately affect all computing. And we've already had Raspberry Pis. We already have other ARM processors in data centers like AWS, but we really haven't had a strong showing of ARM processors on desktops. I know there's a Windows on ARM variant of Windows 10, but it hasn't really caught on. And so we have this chicken or egg problem where desktop applications aren't compiled for ARM because we don't have a lot of people using an ARM OS for their desktop. And so no one wants to run ARM on the desktop because there's not good apps that work on ARM. So with Apple forcing their side of the industry to do this over the next 2 years, what I suspect is going to happen is it will eventually turn into things like Windows on ARM being more popular, because a lot of application developers have never had to care about architecture. They've always built on Intel. We've had Intel as a mainstream on both Apple and Windows for at least 20 years. So I think that long term, 3 to 5 years maybe, we're going to see a steady increase of ARM devices as desktops, which means that application developers are going to have to suddenly care about multi-architecture support, including on servers, where ARM is now getting, especially in 2020, ARM and AWS got much faster and much cheaper to run when you consider price per watt or price per CPU kind of approach. The performance it was improved so much in 2020 with AWS that they're now claiming you can get up to 40% savings if you run the same stuff you normally run on ARM in the data center in AWS. And of course, that's using AWS specific designed processors, I think it's the Gravitons, that are of an ARM design. So here's the thing. My courses have never been tested fully on ARM because there's never really been anyone running ARM to do the courses. You know, there's maybe 1 out of 1,000 people or 1 out of 10,000 people that would ever ask an ARM question in the forums. But now that we've got all this stuff coming, one of the things I hope to do, I don't have a deadline or expectation, but one of the things I want to do is to go back to the courses and simply look at all the images that we use in the courses and make sure that there's an ARM variant. Because if you go back in last week's videos, you will see that I showed some examples of how the same commands you run on an Intel processor today with Docker are the same commands you usually run on ARM. And then it's Docker's job to go find the right image. And unfortunately, for those of us that make Docker images, if we don't cross-compile them, then you can't automatically run them on ARM. And that's the fault of the image creator for not doing that. And anyway, go back to that week's episode if you haven't seen it. We talk about workarounds, we talk about emulation using something called QEMU, where today you can run ARM on your Intel computer. And then when ARM computers come out, you can run Intel Docker containers on the ARM processors. So you can do it backwards and forwards using something known as QEMU. So I did a whole show on that. We're going to do another one. I don't think this month, maybe next month. I haven't set the date yet, but we're going to do another one with more examples. Hey there, Maz. Hello. There we go, Paul. I knew somebody figured it out. Grim Repo. I just loved his name, so I had to get the Octocat shirt of the Grim Repo. Old Man is here for the first time. Hello. Welcome to the show. Juan, I didn't answer your question because I guess I didn't see it. So can you please repost? Because I didn't see it in the list. It didn't show up. Just re-ask it, and I'll get to it. Hello, Netherlands. What's up, Martin? Hello, Mli. Database containers under Docker Desktop might be slower due to file syncs to host OS. So, Biker, I never recommend to anyone that they bind mount databases across the OS barrier. That's simply something I don't suggest anyone do ever, especially in Docker Desktop, because it is going across basically an OS and file system boundary. So the way I recommend everyone do that is, like, let's say you're using Docker Compose with databases locally. You don't do bind mounts, you make volumes, and then you use Docker Compose up, Docker Compose down, and as long as you're using named volumes, the named volumes will not delete the databases when you do the Docker Compose down. You would have to then do a Docker Compose down -v to delete those databases. And when you're using named volumes like that, it will keep the databases in the volumes inside the virtual machine that's running. And the other thing then is people will say, well, I want to store those databases somewhere, so in case I wipe out my Docker, that I can do that. Well, I have the tool for that. It's called vac up, and let's see if I can find it. Did I spell it right? Yeah, backup. So I have a video on this at VACKUP. So it's like backup with a V. So this is a repository that it's a little shell script. So you would just download this shell script, put it somewhere in a binary executable location, and it doesn't do much. But what it does do is it helps you export, import, save, and load volumes. So in this case, if you're running volumes on your local machine inside of Docker, and let's say you want to just move those to a different machine, well, you can use a Docker image to technically do that. Docker images aren't really supposed to store database data, but they totally can. They're just a tarball stored on the internet. So you can do that, or you can export, import, which will copy those files out onto your local host file system inside of a certain directory, and then you can import them back in. So go check that out. I think I have an open bug. I think someone posted a bug the other day. So I've got a couple of bugs in there. I'm not sure about the CentOS one, but I'll have to check that out. Other than that, I tested it a little bit, and it does work. So let me know. What's up, Crazy Max? Zasult, thanks for being thank you. You could even understand me at 2x speed. That's crazy. Wow, that's a lot. Do I have a advanced Docker features course? Sadly, no. I wish I did. I only have the 4 courses so far, and then a bunch of these YouTube videos. Production grade Docker files, caching features. I haven't seen your course, but it seems to cover a lot of basic stuff. So yes, my courses, my Docker Mastery and my Kubernetes Mastery course are meant to start from ground zero. They get more specific as you go. If you go to the end of the Docker Mastery course, maybe the last 50 videos, start to get a little more advanced. I do reviews of real-world production Docker files in there. Again, there's always so much. I could make a 40-hour course on Docker. So I do realize that there are things like multi-stage that I haven't added in yet. There's always going to be something I'm missing. But the course is a living course, and I do plan on adding more things over time. So, give me your feedback on what you think I need there. But yeah, there's right now I'm focused on fixing outdated lectures and bugs in the course, and then we're going to focus on adding new sections to Kubernetes Mastery. Why didn't I provide much hands-on practice in Kubernetes versus Docker? I'm assuming you're saying the Kubernetes Mastery course doesn't have as much hands-on, mostly because I suck. I could have just done better. So there's multiple people have asked for more practice stuff, more hands-on stuff, and so I do intend to add that. I just don't know when. Hopefully this year, but no promises. There's a lot to add there, and I hope to add more and make them better. All of these courses are meant to be living courses. So instead of me making new courses all the time and then leaving the old ones to get outdated and broken, we are updating something in every course almost every month. And that's so that it stays relevant. And we go in and we add if you ever see little blue boxes that show up, that's us fixing something that's changed or fixing something that's broken. So that takes a lot of work to do that. So I'm not so good at making brand new courses all the time on more advanced things. Also, to be honest, advanced courses don't sell very well. You maybe only make, you only sell 10% of the same number of people that buy the basic course will buy the more advanced course. So the problem with advanced courses is they're really hard to make because it's advanced, and so it takes more work. And then they don't sell as well. So the problem is, how do you make it worth your time to spend 4 months dedicated to making a new course that's only going to sell a tenth of the stuff? So it's a problem. So my strategy has been to add more advanced videos to my existing courses, not so much making other courses. So hopefully you like that and you just get more value out of the courses I already have. But that's all coming. So some good books with Docker with Java. So I don't have good books on Docker with Java. I do have a YouTube playlist. So if you go to my YouTube channel and you go down in my video list for playlists, let's see if I can find this. I do have a Docker for Java playlist. So let me send you this playlist. Docker for Java. And there's a couple of really good ones there from another Docker captain, Arun. And he now works at Apple, but he used to work at AWS. And so I have a whole playlist on Java stuff from DockerCon, from Arun Gupta, as well as others. He's also a Java champion, so he's definitely a Java expert. And I put that in chat for you so you can get that. Good luck with your Java apps. What's the difference between entry point and command in the Docker file? That's a good question. So the entry point and command, the entry point is a little bit more advanced. We talk about in the course, you do CMD stuff in the Docker Mastery course, but it's not until late in the course that I show you an example maybe in the last 50 videos of using the entry point. And the entry point is essentially, at the end of the day, what happens when Docker runs your container is it takes whatever's in the entry point and whatever is in the CMD, and it combines them. It puts the entry point first and the CMD second. The two main use cases for that are if you want to run a command line tool. For example, I do that in one of my repos. So http ping. So if we go looking at the Docker file, oh, that's the Docker hub. Let's see. Well, let's go look at the Docker file. So in this repo, just look up http ping, P-I-N-G. And so you can see in here, the thing that I'm doing is the entry point. Again, when it runs, it will just combine the text that's in entry point and the CMD. So in this case, the entry point is http ping, and the command, I'm just adding -- version by default. What does this do? In essence, when you get to the command line, is I can do a Docker run, Bret Fisher, http ping, and if I just run that without anything, okay, so when I didn't add anything to the end, in essence, it ran with the entry point and then the command after it. So it was the equivalent of me running the command http ping -- version. When I do something like this and then I type google.com, that's overriding the CMD. If you remember back to your Docker run training, if you type anything after the image name in a Docker run command, it will replace the CMD for that container. So it's a way to use the entry point and the CMD together to create sort of an easy command line for running command line tools. All right? That's what happens when you run something like bash. You know, when I run something in there and I did something like that, it would override the CMD and run bash. Now, that's one way to use the entry point and CMD. The other way that people like to use it is for running scripts. So they will store a script inside of the entry point, and then the server that it's going to run after that script is done in the CMD. And at the end of the script, if you go look at some of these, for example, go look at the Postgres image or the MySQL image. Those images both use shell scripts inside the image that will do a whole bunch of things. It'll create the default database, it creates the admin user, it sets the password, it does all these things, and then it will pass execution. You'll see at the very last line of your the entry point shell script, it'll have a little ampersand, and that passes execution off to the next part of the line, essentially into the shell. And that's whatever is in the CMD. And with the Postgres and MySQL, that's then running the database. So it's an elegant way to run shell scripts on startup, not in the building of the image, because that would be a run command. But when you start the container, it will always run the entry point. Hopefully that helps. Great question. Does Kubernetes Containerd support the NVIDIA runtime for access to the GPU? That's a great question. I don't know if anyone else in chat has answered that. I don't know. Let's just go look real quick. Containerd. Because they have an image. It's actually on. So yeah, in this image, and there's all these container shims down there, and I suspect what you need is something that can run GPU down there. So I don't really know. I was kind of hoping it would say something down there, but I don't see that it says that. The next thing you would do is just go into the GitHub repo and search. Search for GPU in the issues, you know. Native NVIDIA support. So that looks like a feature that's not been developed. Looks like that there's some NVIDIA work, but I don't exactly know how to do it. So I'm guessing the internet has answered this question, but I have never used GPUs on Kubernetes. So good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. Biker, can you discuss Builda as an alternative to using Docker to build images, especially on a build server? We have Docker on build server, use desktop for dev, but should we use Builda for final? I wouldn't use Builda. I would use BuildKit. BuildKit is now the new building engine that Docker created that is way more performant and has a ton of features. They spent years and years building it. I'm not suggesting that Builda is inferior because I haven't compared in all the different functionality and features, but a lot of what you're going to learn in Builda, or like the reason you would use Builda, you would use in BuildKit. So there's two things you can look at. Just look at BuildKit, the repo. So there's Moby/BuildKit, and it comes with tools. And then look, if you're specifically concerned about building images in production, look at, let's see, I think it's VMware. Yeah. BuildKit CLI for kube control. So here's another thing that you can look at. So the BuildKit CLI for kube control adds BuildKit functionality into kube control. So you can use a Kubernetes cluster to build images there. And I would the reason that I care about this is because I spent so many years learning the Docker and the Docker build command. And then when BuildKit came out, I was learning that up front. And I tried Builda, but it didn't do anything that I couldn't already get with BuildKit or with the standard builder in Docker. I understand that it's daemonless, but so is, you can do that stuff here. And then there's also, is it IMG? You can also check out image. So this is another one. So you might check out IMG. If you simply want a command line that's daemonless, that uses BuildKit, you might also try this out. Genuine Tools is great. These are actually made mostly by Jesse Frizzell, as well as the community. So Jesse's over there. And I would try that first. The only reason is because I just don't know Builda as well. And so I know what BuildKit can do. I know it's got some really great advanced functionality, experimental features, all this stuff. I just don't know about comparing that to Builda. So no knocking of the open source Builda project. I don't have any clients using it. I don't know anyone that uses it regularly for real production business stuff. I'm sure that people do use it, but just no one that I know of. What is my opinion on HashiCorp Nomad? I've been running it for a while, and aside from CSI things not being as developed as one might wish, I am really impressed. I have not looked at it in years, but I know that it has a very active community and it constantly gets updates. So if you like it and it works for you, absolutely use it. I mean, HashiCorp makes great stuff. So I just have had to limit myself to 2 orchestrators in terms of my focus. So I haven't been able to spend much time on Nomad, but I definitely know that their community loves it. They still have a very active community around it. Stan, I really like both your courses. Thank you. It boosted your career. Great. All right. That's what I like to hear. You would like to learn from me on Ingress, TLS, and integration with Cert Manager and Let's Encrypt. So yeah, I haven't put Cert Manager into the courses. Both courses talk a little bit and show examples of using traffic, but not Cert Manager with something like Nginx. I don't have a timeline for when I'm going to add that, but that would be something I'd like to add to the Kubernetes Mastery course because that's that's much more specific. If you're looking for something a little more automated, you might look at Rio, R-I-O, which is Rancher's way of adding a whole bunch of these extra tools like automatic TLS to their Rancher Kubernetes solution. So you might look at rio.io. Hello, Quebec. I've taken your Node Docker course, but I need to watch it again. I need the cheat sheet to recaps the points specific to Node, like user node, the code for proper shutdown. I've never been good at cheat sheets, or at least in making them. And I'll take that feedback under advisement. I would love to have cheat sheets and all of my, the cool looking cheat sheets, the ones that are worthy of printing out with graphics and colors, but I don't have any of those. In Docker Mastery, I do give you the one that Docker made, but that's like 4 years old now, so it's not so great. But thanks for taking my courses. Yeah, there's probably other cheat sheets out there for sure, Turtle. So if you want to mention them here, you may not be able to post links, but if you want to mention them here for others, if you know of them, so people can get their cheat sheets. What are the skills required to get a decent job along with Docker plus Kubernetes? So that was the first question asked today. So you can go all the way back to the beginning of this video or watch it again later. At the very beginning, we talked about if you just type in this link, bret.show/DevOps, that will take you to my full article on DevOps. And I'll just post that again for you. And that's a long question that kind of answers that. I assume that's what you're asking about is Docker and Kubernetes, which are usually related to DevOps jobs. Hello, I am good. Mambadar. We are going into operator and OLM these days. Any stream planned for it? No. Not that I don't want to do it. I just don't have any planned. I have a couple planned for this month, but we don't have a ton of scheduled stuff on the live show for this year yet. We haven't planned it. So stay tuned. I definitely think that we will have more operator stuff this year for Kubernetes as we start to add more people from other projects that can be on the show. But I don't have any planned yet. Is there going to be an update for Docker 2020? Yes. This year. On the databases. Oh, okay, you're just explaining. All right. Something similar in Python for Docker. I don't have that for Python and Docker. Quite honestly, I have a course called Docker for Nodejs. It costs you under $20 to get that course, and you can replace you could basically take that exact course, and it all functions the same way. All the same rules that you apply to Node, which is a scripting language and is compiled just in time, on the fly. That all those same rules apply to Python, but you would just replace the package JSON with the requirements file. You would replace the npm commands with the pip commands. But other than that, it all functions the same. How you get it into your editor, how you do, editing with debuggers, those are all largely the same concepts. And that Docker for Node.js course really functions on the patterns and the workflows that you use for how do you develop on a scripting language with something like Docker Desktop, that's that kind of thing. So I would say, for that price, you could probably get a ton of value out of like multi-stage builds and how you do that for comparing production to development Docker files and all the sorts of stuff that you do in there. How do you delete all of the test and dev stuff out of your containers before production? How do you make sure that doesn't go into production? That's all in that Docker for Node.js course. I didn't want to make the same exact course for Python because it would be like 80% of the exact same material, and then I would just have to replace the word npm with pip. So I would say take that course and just in your brain translate those out. But I don't have any Python resources specifically. I don't have any good resources for ECS Fargate hands-on. So there are probably other courses that can do that. Mad Max, the full DevOps course. So we have started, we are not recording that yet, but we have started the planning for a DevOps fundamentals course. Basically, it's not going to show any tools. It's only going to talk about concepts and workflows and the processes that you need to worry about. And we might mention some tools, but we're not going to, it's not going to teach you Jenkins, because to me, that's not teaching DevOps. That's teaching Jenkins. That's a CI course. Whereas I think a lot of the industry is missing DevOps essentials from maybe a manager point of view, or someone who needs to get into DevOps, but before they learn tooling, they need to understand the concepts, and they need to do something like the DevOps Handbook. They need to read that DevOps Handbook, which is a great book. If you haven't read it yet, read the DevOps Handbook. It will give you lots of practical advice. But we're planning on that being the next course. I do not know when, unfortunately, it will be released because we haven't started recording yet. But we are working on the content. Let's see. What terminal am I using on my Mac? It doesn't look like iTerm2. It is absolutely iTerm2. And you can get all of my shell stuff at bretfisher.com/shell. So all of my themes and tools are all there at that website. Maxim, recommended to use as a common disk for Docker Swarm nodes on DigitalOcean to place volumes. Is it okay to use GlusterFS cluster on the same droplets as Swarm? So I don't know, Maxim. I don't know. I only use DigitalOcean's block storage, the DOBS, and that works for me on Swarm with the old but still functioning for me driver from what's it called? RexRay. So RexRay, while a project that's no longer maintained, it has worked for me most of the time. I probably wouldn't run high-end production stuff on it, but my website still runs on it. So it gets updated every so often, maybe once a month, and everything works fine. So I do that, but I have never used GlusterFS in production. They're completely two different technologies, by the way. Gluster is all about replicating data And in a lot of cases, you don't need to do that. You just need to connect to, the right container to the right block storage from your cloud provider. So I would just do that. Or even better, try the Kubernetes on DigitalOcean. You don't even have to manage. They will upgrade your Kubernetes for you. They'll manage your Kubernetes for you. You can actually swap out nodes with their Kubernetes, and then it automatically uses their ingress proxies. It automatically uses their block storage without you having to add a bunch of third-party stuff. So if you're a fan of Swarm and you want something easy on the Kubernetes side, the DigitalOcean Kubernetes is definitely one of the easier ones to get started and use. I like it and I use it. Our E2K team already working on runtime repo for adding E2K architecture support and planning to finish later this year. Could you remind me how we can integrate our changes with Docker? I'm not sure if you're talking about a different architecture, because I don't know what E2K is, then you would use that Docker manifest command and the Docker buildx command. Go back and look at my videos from last week. That's all about ARM and M1, and we talk about multi-architecture, what a manifest file is, and how you use that with Docker. I think I hope that answers your question. Not sure. What would you recommend? Excuse me. What would you recommend to use to configure firewall on a Docker host to analyze logs and block users by IP? Docker alters IP table rules, and tools like CSF, LFD don't seem to play well together. Quite frankly, Dimitri, I don't. I use an external firewall that is, like let's say VPS security rules in AWS, or some external firewall at the VLAN layer. I don't tend to mess with host firewalls when I'm doing container solutions. I just don't have any recent experience. I think that maybe the last time I did something like that was Red Hat back in 2017, and using for a specific client that had specific requirements. And I was not the one to implement the firewall solution, so I don't have really a good answer for you. If you need something really advanced, by the way, Dimitri, on firewalls and network security policies, then you probably don't want to be looking at Docker. You probably want to start looking at Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is where all of the partners and all of the third-party tools are integrating into Kubernetes and applying things like network policies to give you that granular level of control at not just the host level, but also the container level, the pod level. You can do all those things in Kubernetes, whereas Docker did not provide that functionality out of the box. So. Let's see, what other questions we got? Do I have plans for a course on CI/CD with Kubernetes, Argo, Flux, Tekton? I would love to do a GitOps course. So that is definitely something I want to do. I just don't know when, because I think this year primarily for us is going to be adding more videos to the Kubernetes Mastery course, fixing and updating videos in the Docker Mastery course, and then working on a DevOps fundamental course. So I don't know when GitOps, but look in this YouTube channel. I have had multiple guests on over the last year who specifically talk about GitOps. We've talked about Argo, we've talked about Flux, we've done demos. So go to that link, the Bret.live link that will take you to this channel, and you can look at the back videos, the old videos, and there are multiple GitOps videos. And hopefully those will get you started, help you learn the tools, and give some examples of how they work. I've definitely had some experts on that know a lot more about it than I do. Donald, I'm not sure if I think I answered that question already. Is there a way to call host command from Docker container? Yeah, I did that earlier with the command is on all hosts. So let's see, where did I do that? over here, my dog versus cat, this example does that exact thing on a swarm. It will run that command, and I run it in deploy mode global. So that means that Docker is going to spin up a service replica container on every host in the swarm. And then because I mount the Docker socket, it's going to run that command on the host. Now, if I needed to do something else on the host, you could do a very similar thing where you can have, essentially, because the services don't necessarily have privilege mode, where privilege mode gives you full root access on the machine, you could run a regular Docker container, because that's kind of what this is doing, right? This is running a regular Docker command on the host OS, not inside the container itself, but it's running it from inside a container in the Swarm service. You could do the same thing by having Docker run a Docker. You could replace this with a Docker run command that essentially. Also, there's another one example I have here where Swarm does not have a built-in way to add a volume driver to every node by default, right? So I do the same thing here. I run this something called Swarm exec, which essentially has the Docker command in it, but it's designed to do something similar to what the Docker image does, where it helps you run commands on the host OS. Then I mount the socket, and then I even give it a secret, which is the Rexray token. And I'm running this command, but it runs it on the host. So it's as if I was sitting on the host CLI, and it runs that against the Docker socket. Now, if I needed to truly run something on the host, then I could change this command to do Docker run -- privileged, and then that container that I run would have its own command that would run on the host. So it's a little nested, and it's a little difficult to understand it all, but that's one way you can do it. Will there be any implementation for auto-scaling in Swarm? Yeah, there are multiple ways. There are third-party tools to auto-scale. Orbiter is one of them, but I don't think Docker or Mirantis is going to add auto-scaling anytime soon. The reason is you've got to have some sort of third-party monitoring that will keep track of the metrics over time and then make decisions about auto-scaling based on those metrics. Now, you could simply auto-scale the nodes by, if you're on AWS, just use an auto-scale in AWS, and it just does node auto-scaling, and you can do that. And that doesn't have anything to do with Swarm internals. You would just basically, in the cloud init script, you would set it to auto-join the Swarm by doing a Swarm join. And so you could do that. But for scaling up the replicas, there's multiple examples out there, including one from Alex Ellis. If you just look up Alex Ellis Swarm autoscale. Yeah, so he's got something from years ago on his blog about how to do that with Prometheus pretty easily. So you could also look that up. Would my Docker Node course be useful for developing a dev environment for Nuxt.js apps? I do not know, because I don't know what Nuxt.js app is, but likely, because I still recommend that course for anyone that uses a scripting language, because every one of those scripting languages is very similar. It has debuggers, it compiles on the fly, it has dependency graphs and dependency command lines that run on your machine. These are all very similar concepts, whether it's Python, Ruby, Node, whatever. So I would recommend that course. You're just going to have to mentally, if you know what an npm command is, replace that with whatever your dependency builder command is, and away you go. Do you recommend to learn Docker Swarm to manage simple client-server applications? Thanks for the live chat. I took one of your courses and it boosted my career too. Thanks, Odo. Great. I'm glad that helped you. I do recommend Swarm. I don't think that I'm at the point anymore of recommending Swarm for business, mostly because one, Mirantis has taken over Swarm support, but they haven't exactly met their commitments in terms of features. For example, a year ago, they stated they were going to add CSI support, but I haven't seen anything out of the team for that, so I don't know if we're going to have improved storage support in Swarm. As well, the other big reason that I wasn't wanting to support Kubernetes all those years was Kubernetes was hard to deploy and maintain. And we now have much easier ways to do that. We have every cloud now provides their own way of managing Kubernetes for you. You can use Fargate. You can use things like Google Cloud Run that, it doesn't really use Kubernetes from your point of view, but it's running containers without you having to worry about the infrastructure. And Fargate does that as well. And so I'm more focused on helping teams remove their server administration burden. And if that means they need to run Rancher, then, or some cloud provided Kubernetes, then great. That's something that's more automated, easier to maintain. We also have things now like K3s. K3s still requires that you spin up servers and manage your own servers, but it is an easier way to deploy, and it's also lower resource utilization, which is similar to what Swarm was. Swarm was very resource efficient, and so that's one of the reasons I liked it. And so it's not that I don't want anyone to use Swarm. It's just I use it personally for small projects, for personal projects. But if a business is moving forward on new projects today, I'm probably going to recommend first, I'm going to see if they don't even have to run Kubernetes because they can just run a cloud thing. And if they can run, Fargate or Google Cloud Run or something like that, then they never have to run servers, and good for them. If they need to run servers, then ideally maybe it's something like EKS or Azure's Kubernetes or DigitalOcean's Kubernetes or Linode's Kubernetes. And then after that, I would probably recommend Rancher just because it's cloud agnostic and it can also manage multiple Kubernetes clusters. So yeah, I would probably do that before I recommend Swarm, just because I think we've seen enough years of Swarm not getting new features that it's so far behind the curve, and Kubernetes is getting easier and easier all the time. So yeah, I don't know. It's not that I'm anti-Swarm. It's just, and it doesn't mean go replace all your Swarm clusters. If they work, just like mine work, leave them there. If they work, if they solve your problem, great. Stay on Swarm. Thank you very much for your courses. I have taken Docker Mastery and Kubernetes Mastery, and have you used the Lens IDE, and what's your take on it? The IDEs are great. There's Lens, as well as the other one, which is Infra. So look up INFRA, which is another desktop application. I don't tend to use them just because my job isn't to maintain server infrastructure and Kubernetes infrastructure for my clients. So they might use them. I won't use them for like deployments or anything. So I play with them, and then I don't really use them because I'm more of a command line person anyway. But I do like how they're starting to integrate graphics and other information in an easy to view way. So check out Lens from Mirantis, and then Infra, which is actually from the Docker team. They spun off into a separate little company, but it's from the Docker team that made what was it? Kitematic, which was a Docker GUI way back in the day. Do I have recommendations about implementing, hello Eric, implementing read-write mini access mode volumes on Kubernetes? I heard about Rook and NFS, for example. So Rook, yes, a couple of things there. Rook is an application that helps manage your storage in Kubernetes, but it doesn't itself provide read-write mini. So when you say read-write mini, what I assume is you mean many different containers on different hosts can all write to the same location, and that is specifically going to require you to use NFS. I don't know of any other block-based storage. So there's block-based, like a file system, and then there's object-based, like S3, right? And in our DevOps chat, actually, up there in the corner, devops.fan, recently we had a whole conversation around block storage versus object storage. And so if you're still needing to use file storage, traditional file server storage, that's known as block storage, and you're going to have to use NFS. Now, if you're on AWS, then in that case, you would use their EFS, Elastic File Storage. And that in the background is going to give you shared network NFS file storage, and you don't need Rook to manage that. You can just add that driver using the standard persistent volume claims in Kubernetes. Rook is something that is better if you need to implement Ceph, for example, and Ceph would replicate storage across multiple nodes. That is useful when you maybe need, here's an example, if you need a blog that when you upload the images to your blog, let's say WordPress, and you need those images to be fast, like fast read response, so they need to be local, and they don't get written to very often. Usually with that, in that case, you write a JPEG to the file system once, and then you never write it again. If you upload another file, it uploads it to a different place. You could use Ceph for that, because the way that replicates files, it means that you would never really have the conflict of two different servers trying to write to the same file at the same time. That usually wouldn't happen. So you could use Rook, and then Rook is a storage orchestrator that would automatically set up Ceph for you and manage your Ceph cluster. And then you could potentially then assign volumes on that Ceph cluster to your WordPress apps in a redundant fashion. Or you could just use EFS for network file storage in that case. So hopefully that helps. I'd say the hardest type of storage to do in distributed systems is read-write mini block I/O. That's the hardest solution to implement. So usually for people, I recommend build your apps to not do that. Build your apps a different way. Have them using databases or object storage like S3, and don't have them all having to write and read to the same file server at the same time, because that limits your choices. For example, DigitalOcean doesn't have a solution for that unless you use their object store. It doesn't have a block storage like NFS kind of thing. So it also makes it more complicated in the data center, where you may not have a high-end NFS server available to use. And NFS is not something that you want to manage on your own unless you're a file system expert and you know about NFS and how to manage that in an enterprise. So anyway, am I planning on touching on Istio? Yes, so we have had shows where we've talked about Istio in the past, and I don't have any timeline for when it's going to show up in the course, but eventually I will have a few lectures on that in the Kubernetes Mastery course, because we are going to talk a little bit about service mesh at some point, but I'm not going to go deep diving. I'm not going to make an Istio course anytime soon. There is actually, if I go to Udemy, let's see, I think, so if you just look up Istio on Udemy, there's people that we've already had on this show, actually. Victor Farsick, who has multiple courses here that Istio is in the Canary deployments with Istio, Kubernetes Chaos Engineering with Istio. So those courses might be good for you to check out. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Let's see, get a couple more questions, and then unfortunately, I'm not going to maybe be able to answer them all because you've got so many great questions. Let's see. What would you suggest a good way to assigning resource limits on pods? I see that my nodes are overcommitted most of the time because we underestimate it every time. Well, I assume that you're using reservations and limits inside of Kubernetes, the built-in functionality for that. Other than that, you just need to use monitoring tools to profile your apps to know what resources they truly need, and then to give them those resources and no more, right? I don't have any magic for that, but I think most teams, they go into it just assigning really high numbers because they don't really know. So I would use your profiling, like your monitoring tools, to profile your applications and understand their usage over time in terms of memory and CPU utilization, and then to start lowering the limits on your pods, because you don't want to go too hardcore, because then you'll end up kicking them out, right, and causing them to be booted, and that's not a good thing. But I don't have any magic for that. I don't know of a tool that automatically does it either, unless someone else does in chat and can mention it, but I don't know that. Service accounts in Kubernetes Mastery course. Yeah, I don't actually talk about them. They are used in the course because when you deploy the dashboard, as well as traffic ingress, you are using service accounts. But I'm trying to remember, there may be slides in there already that just don't have a video with them. So if I have slides on them, then yes. So you could go to slides.kubernetesmastery.com and just go through the table of contents there, looking for stuff talking about service accounts, because some of that stuff is in there that's just not made it into videos yet. Oh, Anton, you're asking about so you have a brand new CPU architecture, adding it to Docker. So the real question is, does the Go language have a compiler for your architecture? Docker, just like Kubernetes, is built in Go, and I would say that any CPU architecture that has a Go compiler can eventually and can run Linux, assuming, can work with Go. So that's the two requirements, right? You can compile with Go, and it runs Linux. If you can do that, this is also a good example of how ARM started out. ARM didn't have a lot of official support early on, and so third-party Raspberry Pi hackers were all, getting a Go compiler on an ARM Linux machine and then trying to work out the ways to compile Docker for that architecture. So you would have to go about that same process. In terms of getting Docker to do it officially, you would just have to reach out to their sales team, I guess, or find some of their engineers on Twitter and ask them for advice. One is Justin Cormack. You can reach out to Justin Cormack, JustinCormack. He's been on this show just weeks ago when we talked about, actually, it was maybe last month or in November. You can go back at Bret.live. You can go back, find him in there, and find him on Twitter and see what he says. Kubernetes on-prem is going to be the same challenges as running like a VMware architecture on-prem. You have to be infrastructure experts, you have to be storage experts, networking experts. You're going to have to worry about proxies, ingress proxies, stuff like that, and possibly even VLANs, server OSs. Like, these are all the infrastructure and automation problems that you're going to have to handle, as well as then learning Kubernetes on top of that. So there are a lot. I recommend, if you're new to all that you buy some solution that solves a lot of those problems for you, like maybe the VMware solution or Rancher, and even possibly get their consulting. If you buy the support packages, sometimes you'll get a set of consulting hours to help you deploy the solution to make the deployment go faster so that you can get started quicker. You are most welcome, Jean-Paul. Have you seen the way OpenShift shows the possibility to access the terminal? Is there an open source tool that does the same besides Portainer for Kubernetes? Have you looked at the Kubernetes dashboard? There are many dashboards. I'm assuming you're talking about a web GUI that gives you the terminal. And you can do a lot of those things with the different GUIs. There's at least 4 or 5 of them, and most of them have a way to get into the container shell. So you can go to the Kubernetes landscape at CNCF to look up dashboards, or probably just Google Kubernetes dashboards, and you'll see a lot of blog articles comparing them all, and you can do that. All right, let's see. What's going to be the last 3 questions? Last 3 questions. Cryo in relation to Docker. Cryo's fine, but Cryo doesn't have as much flexibility as Containerd. And so I prefer Containerd. So you have 3 runtimes for Kubernetes. Docker is still the default, although we will probably see that shift to Containerd being the default by the end of this year. And then Cryo is mostly just used for OpenShift. And so it is the default with OpenShift. And it is specifically only for Kubernetes, where Containerd is not just for Kubernetes, but the Containerd community has really rallied around all this new functionality of Containerd. So for example, you see, if you look at just this image, you see all this extra functionality with containerd down at the bottom. You get this, you can run Kata, Firecracker, gvisor, all these different, you can encrypt your image store. You can do some pretty cool stuff there, all inside of containerd with all the plugin models that it supports. So I don't know about the feature feature to feature with Cryo. I don't believe it supports as much of this stuff as containerd does. So I generally don't use it unless someone is using OpenShift and then the choice is already made for you, so you're using Cryo. You said, thanks, just went and purchased the Node Docker course, tried to set up my Nux dev environment on my own with only partial success. Yeah, so good luck. And the course comes with Q&A, so if you have specific questions, feel free to jump in the Q&A or into the chat that you also get with the courses to ask questions. Thanks for buying the course. Good luck. Jean-Paul, unfortunately, I have no answers for you on big data. I've not worked on any major big data projects, so I don't really have specific tooling suggestions. There's probably, what I would probably look into, there's a Google project that runs on top of Kubernetes that helps with that stuff. Let's see if I can find it. Kubeflow. So big data and ML aren't exactly the same, but some of the same problems are dealt with. So you might look at some of the stuff under Kubeflow. Just a suggestion. I'm not an expert on it, but try that out. Kubeflow.org. All right, last question. Yes, and also Tech World with Nana is great. She's also another YouTube channel, and I'm a big fan of all the good stuff she's doing. Question came up today. Does ARM, okay, so this is going to be the last question. ARM containers. All right, ARM will be the last thing. Does ARM-based machines require a different packaging of Docker images? Yes, because ARM is a different CPU architecture. Docker does not translate CPU architecture. So on Windows, if you're running Docker in Windows container mode, it requires a Windows binary. If you're running on an x86-64 architecture, by default, Docker will only run an x86-64 binary because it's running it on the host kernel. Docker doesn't have its own kernel. So if you have an ARM device and you want to run Docker natively, you need to have those images built in ARM. Now, there's something called QEMU, which does provide architecture emulation. And this comes built into Docker Desktop. All of this was covered in not last week's show. Actually, was it last week's show? Might have been last week's show. So if I just went to Bret.live, and then I looked at last week's show, I would go watch last week's show, ARM, M1, and Docker. That talks all about ARM architecture, what are manifest files, all that stuff. I would recommend you go check that whole episode out. It's almost an hour and a half long, but it's full of that stuff. We focused exclusively on that for the time frame. So, all right. So hopefully everyone, I answered your questions. Thank you so much for being here. If you didn't know, this show happens every week live on Thursdays at the same time. And of course, you can always watch old episodes at Bret.live. And I will be back here next week on YouTube Live. Do we have a guest next week? We have a guest next week. So we're going to be talking about something. Anyway, like and subscribe. Brandon Mitchell is going to be on the show. So we're going to talk about some tool he has created for managing Docker Hub. It's pretty cool. I think it's called Reg CLI. And he's another Docker captain. and he creates open source tools and helps people in the community over on Stack Overflow. So if you've ever went on Stack Overflow and asked a question about Docker, he was B. Mitch, and he's I think the second most popular Docker question answer person on Stack Overflow. So we're going to have him on the show next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. So bring your hard questions, and we're going to talk about Docker Hub and managing your registries from the command line and all the cool stuff he's developing with that. All right, so I'll see you here next week on YouTube Live. Patreon is the place to support this, by the way. So go over to patreon.com/Bret Fisher, and I will see you next week. Ciao.